The hot Arizona sun burned down mercilessly as Rose Reynolds struggled against the iron grip of her father's men, her white wedding dress catching on the rough-hewn wooden steps of Seligman's only chapel. It was 1878, and in this dusty corner of the Arizona Territory, a woman's tears meant little when weighed against a business arrangement between men. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking as they dragged her toward the altar where Bartholomew Winters, a man 3 times her age with cold eyes and calloused hands, waited with an impatient scowl. "I don't love him. I won't marry him." Rose's protests fell on deaf ears as the chapel door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate within its stuffy confines. Outside, away from the prying eyes of the townsfolk, Garrett Dawson leaned against a weathered hitching post, his dark hat pulled low over his eyes while his Palomino stallion, Thunder, pawed restlessly at the ground. His hand rested on the worn leather of his holster, fingers drumming in quiet contemplation as the sounds of Rose's sobs filtered through the chapel's thin walls. He'd given her his word. And a man like Garrett never broke a promise, especially not to a woman he'd come to care for more than he dared admit. 3 months earlier, Rose had arrived in Seligman aboard the eastbound train from California, her red gold hair gleaming in the sunlight as she stepped onto the platform. At 21, she possessed a quiet dignity that immediately caught the attention of everyone present, including Garrett. Her father, Harold Reynolds, had purchased the largest cattle ranch outside town, sight unseen, following the sudden death of its previous owner. That same afternoon, Garrett had been delivering supplies to the general store when he first spoke to Rose. She'd been examining bolts of fabric, her slender fingers running over the materials with a thoughtful expression. "The blue would suit you," he'd said, tipping his hat politely when she turned. A smile had touched her lips, bringing a warmth to her green eyes that made his breath catch. "I was thinking the same thing, Mr. Dawson. Garrett Dawson," he replied, extending his hand. "I run the smaller spread east of town. Your father bought the Morrison place, I hear." "Rose Reynolds," she'd answered, her handshake firm despite her delicate appearance. "Yes, father has grand plans for expanding the ranch. He's determined to build the largest cattle operation in the territory." Something in her tone had caught his attention, a subtle note of resignation that seemed at odds with her words. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed frequently in town. Each encounter strengthened the connection between them, and Garrett found himself making excuses to visit Seligman more often than his ranch work required. During one such visit, he'd found Rose sitting alone by Sycamore Creek, just outside town, her skirts spread around her on the grassy bank as she sketched in a small journal. "Mind if I join you?" he'd asked, standing a respectful distance away. She'd closed her journal quickly but nodded, making space beside her. "I come here to think. Father believes drawing is a frivolous pastime for a rancher's daughter." "What does he expect from you, then?" Garrett had asked, settling beside her. Rose had laughed without humor. "To be useful. To marry advantageously. To further the Reynolds name and fortune without complaint." She'd glanced at him then, a flash of defiance in her eyes. "But I have my own dreams." "Tell me about them," he'd encouraged, and she had. She'd spoken of wanting to study art in San Francisco, of seeing the grand cities of the East, of living by her own choices rather than her father's demands. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the creek, she'd allowed him a glimpse of her drawings, landscapes of remarkable skill and beauty that captured the wild spirit of the territory. "You have a gift," he'd told her sincerely. "A useless one, according to my father," she'd replied with a sad smile. Their meetings had continued, always in seeming happenstance, though both knew better. Garrett had shown her his favorite places in the hills surrounding Seligman, hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, vantage points that offered sweeping views of the vast landscape. In those private moments, he told her of his own journey west after the war, of building his modest ranch from nothing, of his hopes to create something lasting in this untamed country. "I've never met anyone like you, Garrett," she'd confessed one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. "Most men I've known care only for appearances and advantages. You see the world differently." He'd wanted to take her hand then to tell her that she'd changed something fundamental in him, but propriety held him back. Instead, he'd simply nodded, saying, "The right things are worth fighting for, Rose. Remember that." The idyll had shattered 6 weeks ago when Reynolds announced his daughter's engagement to Bartholomew Winters, the wealthy owner of the territory's largest mining operation. At 58, Winters was known for his ruthless business practices and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the deaths of his previous 2 wives. Garrett had heard the news in town, the gossip spreading quickly through Seligman's small population. That evening he'd ridden to the creek, hoping against hope that Rose might be there. She was, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Is it true?" he'd asked without preamble. "Yes," she'd whispered. "Father arranged everything without consulting me. The marriage will connect his cattle business with Bartholomew's mines, a perfect business arrangement." Her bitter laugh had cut through the evening air. "The wedding is set for August 15th. And what do you want, Rose?" Garrett had moved closer, his voice low and urgent. She'd looked up at him then, her expression vulnerable yet determined. "I want to choose my own path, my own husband." The last word had been barely audible, but it had sent a current of electricity through him. "Then do it," he'd urged. "Leave with me. We could head to California, start fresh." "Father would never allow it," she'd said, shaking her head. "He'd track us down. Winters has men everywhere." "We'd find a way," Garrett had insisted, taking her hand in his for the first time. Her fingers had felt small but strong in his calloused palm. They'd spoken long into the night, planning and discarding options, finally agreeing that open defiance would be too dangerous. Winters was known to be vindictive, and Reynolds was not a man to cross lightly. They needed time and careful planning. As July turned to August, however, Harold had grown suspicious of his daughter's frequent rides alone. He'd assigned one of his ranch hands to accompany her everywhere, effectively cutting off her private meetings with Garrett. The wedding preparations had accelerated, and Rose found herself trapped in a nightmare that moved inexorably toward its conclusion. Their last conversation had been brief and desperate, snatched in the shadows behind the general store when Rose had managed to slip away from her escort for a few precious minutes. "I can't bear it, Garrett," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The wedding is in 3 days. Winters. The way he looks at me." She'd shuddered. "I'd rather die than be his wife." Garrett had made his decision in that moment. "Listen carefully, Rose. Go through with the ceremony. I'll be waiting outside the chapel with thunder. When you hear 3 shots fired in quick succession, find a way to get outside. I'll create a diversion and we'll ride hard for the territorial border." "It's madness," she'd protested, even as hope flickered in her eyes. "It's freedom," he'd countered, daring to brush a tear from her cheek. "Do you trust me?" "With my life," she'd answered without hesitation. Now, as Garrett waited outside the chapel, the weight of that trust pressed upon him like a physical burden. Inside, he knew Rose was facing her worst fears alone. The chapel had filled with Seligman's prominent citizens witnesses to a union built on greed and power rather than love. Sheriff Miller passed by, nodding curtly to Garrett. "Thought you'd be inside, Dawson." Big event for our little town. Just waiting on a friend, Garrett replied evenly, though his heart hammered in his chest. The sheriff moved on, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. Through the chapel's open windows, Garrett heard the minister's voice rise and fall, reciting the familiar wedding ceremony. He checked his pocket watch. Only minutes remained before Rose would be legally bound to Winters. He loosened his revolver in its holster and prepared to mount Thunder. Inside the chapel, Rose stood before the altar, her body rigid with despair. Her father's firm grip on her arm prevented any thought of escape. Across from her, Bartholomew Winters smirked triumphantly, his balding head gleaming with sweat despite the efforts of a young boy waving a palm leaf fan. "We are gathered here today," intoned Reverend Simmons, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Rose barely heard the words over the roaring in her ears. Her gaze darted to the chapel doors, willing them to open, praying for Garrett's signal. The Reverend's voice droned on, approaching the moment of no return. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Rose closed her eyes, tears seeping from beneath her lashes. Then it came 3 distinct gunshots in rapid succession, followed by shouts of alarm from outside. The chapel erupted in confusion as men rose from their seats, hands moving instinctively to their weapons. "Stay where you are," Harold Reynolds commanded, but his momentary distraction allowed Rose to wrench free of his grasp. With the instinct of desperation, she gathered her voluminous skirts and pushed through the startled wedding guests toward the side door of the chapel. Behind her, she heard Winters bellow in outrage, "Stop her!" The heavy wooden door yielded to her frantic push, and Rose stumbled into the blinding Arizona sunlight. Garrett was there, thunder dancing nervously as gunshots continued to sound from the far side of the building, a diversion Garrett had arranged with a trusted friend. "Rose!" He extended his hand down to her, thunder sidling close to the chapel steps. Without hesitation, she grasped his outstretched arm, and with strength born of desperation, he pulled her up behind him onto the horse's back. "Hold tight," he commanded, and she wrapped her arms around his waist just as the chapel's main doors burst open, disgorging a stream of angry men led by her father and Winters. "Rose Reynolds," Harold's voice cracked like a whip, "get down from that horse immediately." Garrett's response was to dig his heels into Thunder's flanks. The powerful horse leaped forward, nearly unseating Rose, who clutched Garrett more tightly as they thundered down Seligman's Main Street. Behind them, shouts and the sounds of men rushing to their horses faded as Thunder carried them swiftly toward the outskirts of town. Rose buried her face against Garrett's back, the reality of what they had done washing over her in waves of terror and exhilaration. They rode hard for miles, following a creek bed where the rocky ground would make their trail difficult to follow. When they finally stopped to rest the horse in a sheltered canyon, Garrett turned to look at Rose properly for the first time since their escape. Her wedding dress was torn and dusty, her carefully arranged hair had come loose and streamed down her back in tangles, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. To Garrett, she had never looked more beautiful. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, still struggling to catch her breath. I was afraid you wouldn't come." "I gave you my word," he said simply, helping her down from Thunder's back. "I know a place about 10 miles from here where we can rest tonight. My friend Jacob has a line shack in the hills that he doesn't use this time of year." As they prepared to continue their journey, Rose suddenly froze, listening intently. "Horses," she whispered, fear etching new lines around her eyes. Garrett's hand moved to his revolver, but he relaxed slightly when a familiar figure emerged from the brush leading two mounts. "It's just Thomas," he explained. "My ranch foreman. I asked him to bring fresh horses and supplies." Thomas nodded respectfully to Rose as he approached. "Miss Reynolds." "Got everything you asked for, Garrett. Clothes for the lady, food, water, and ammunition." He handed over a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Sheriff's organizing a search party. Your father's offering $1,000 for information, miss." Rose blanched at this news, but Garrett squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We'll be long gone before they figure out which way we've headed. Did you send the telegram?" Thomas nodded. "Train tickets will be waiting in Prescott under the name you gave me, John and Mary Fletcher." He glanced at Rose. "No offense, miss, but you'll need to change out of that dress if you don't want to attract attention." While Garrett and Thomas transferred their supplies to the fresh horses, Rose retreated behind a stand of cottonwoods to change into the clothes. Thomas had brought a simple skirt, shirtwaist, and sturdy boots that were slightly too large but serviceable. When she emerged, Garrett couldn't help but stare. Even in plain clothing, with her hair hastily braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she carried herself with a natural grace that took his breath away. "Will I pass inspection?" she asked with a hint of her old spirit. "You'll do," he replied with a smile, though the truth was she could have worn sackcloth and still been the most captivating woman he'd ever known. They parted ways with Thomas, who would return to Garrett's ranch and maintain the fiction that his employer was away on business in Tucson. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape, Garrett led Rose deeper into the wilderness, following trails that only the most experienced trackers would recognize. "My father won't give up easily," Rose said as they picked their way through a narrow canyon. "He sees me as property, not a daughter, and Winters." She shuddered. "His pride won't allow him to be humiliated this way." "We have a 3-day head start to Prescott," Garrett reassured her. "From there, the train will take us to California. Your father may have influence in the Arizona territory, but it doesn't extend to San Francisco." They reached the line shack just as darkness fell, a simple one-room structure nestled against a hillside and hidden by juniper trees. Inside, it was spare but clean, with a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. "It's not much," Garrett apologized as he lit the oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam. Rose looked around with genuine appreciation. "It's perfect," she said softly. "It's freedom." They shared a simple meal of jerky, hard biscuits, and coffee, sitting at the table as Garrett outlined their route to Prescott and the precautions they would need to take. Rose listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed her quick intelligence. As the night deepened around them, an awkward tension grew in the small space. There was only the one cot, barely wide enough for a single person. "You take the bed," Garrett said firmly. "I'll sleep by the stove." Rose hesitated, then nodded, too exhausted to argue. She removed her boots but otherwise lay down fully clothed, pulling the rough woolen blanket over herself. Garrett settled on the floor, his saddle as a pillow, his revolver within easy reach. "Garrett?" Rose's voice came softly through the darkness after he had extinguished the lamp. "Yes." "Thank you for risking everything for me." He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Some things are worth any risk, Rose." She made no reply, but in the silence that followed, something unspoken passed between them, a current of emotion too complex to name but too powerful to deny. Morning came early, with thin gray light filtering through the shack's single window. They ate quickly and were on the trail again before sunrise, pushing the horses at a steady pace while avoiding the main roads. Rose proved to be a strong rider, keeping up without complaint despite what must have been considerable discomfort after the previous day's hard journey. By midday, they had covered nearly 15 miles, following a route that took them through increasingly rugged country. As they paused to rest the horses beside a small spring, Garrett studied the horizon with a frown. "Dust cloud," he said, pointing to a distant smudge against the sky. "Riders moving fast. Could be your father's men." Rose's face tightened with fear, but she squared her shoulders resolutely. "What do we do?" "Change our plans," Garrett decided. "They'll expect us to head for Prescott. We'll swing north instead, make for Flagstaff. It's farther, but we can catch the train there too." The detour added miles to their journey and took them through treacherous terrain, where the horses had to pick their way carefully across rock-strewn slopes. By nightfall, both Rose and Garrett were exhausted, and they made camp in a sheltered hollow where the light from their small fire wouldn't be visible from a distance. As they huddled close to the flames, the desert night turning bitterly cold around them, Rose broke the silence that had fallen between them. "Tell me about your home, your ranch," Garrett smiled, warming to the subject. "It's small compared to your father's spread just 500 acres and about 200 head of cattle, but the land is good, with year-round water from a spring that never runs dry. I built the house myself, added to it over the years." He paused, suddenly self-conscious. "It's nothing fancy." "It sounds wonderful," Rose said sincerely. "A place built with your own hands where you answer to no one but yourself." She gazed into the fire, her expression wistful. "I've never known that kind of independence." "You will," he promised. "In California, you can study art, just like you've always wanted." She looked up at him, a question in her eyes that she seemed afraid to voice. Finally, she asked, "And what about you? Will you go back to your ranch after you've seen me safely to San Francisco?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Garrett had not allowed himself to think beyond getting Rose to safety, afraid to hope for more than that. "I don't know," he admitted. "My ranch is all I have, all I've worked for." "I understand," she said quickly, though disappointment flickered across her face. "You've already sacrificed so much to help me. I couldn't ask for more." Garrett reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "Rose." The crack of a rifle shot split the night, the bullet thudding into the ground inches from where they sat. Instantly, Garrett was on his feet, pulling Rose with him toward the horses as more shots rang out. "Go," he shouted, practically throwing her onto her mount while he returned fire, aiming at the muzzle flashes visible on the ridge above them. They galloped blindly through the darkness, guided only by starlight and Garrett's instinctive knowledge of the land. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the thunder of pursuing horses. For hours, they pushed on, changing direction frequently to confuse their trackers, fording streams to break their trail. Just before dawn, they reached a series of steep ravines where the horses could go no further. Leaving the exhausted animals concealed in a stand of scrub oak, they continued on foot, climbing steadily upward toward a ridgeline that Garrett knew offered a hidden path to the other side. Rose stumbled frequently on the treacherous terrain, her city-bred legs unused to such demands, but she never complained. When she fell, cutting her hand on a jagged rock, she merely wrapped her handkerchief around the wound and pressed on, her jaw set with determination. They reached the summit as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the eastern horizon, illuminating a vast panorama of mesas and canyons stretching to the distant mountains. There, Garrett pointed to a thin ribbon of silver winding through the landscape below. "The little Colorado River. If we can reach it by nightfall, we can follow it to Flagstaff." Rose nodded, too breathless to speak, her face pale with exhaustion beneath the grime of their journey. "We need to rest," Garrett decided, looking at her with concern. Just for an hour. There's a cave not far from here where we'll be hidden. The cave was little more than a shallow depression in the rock face, but it offered shelter from both the elements and prying eyes. Inside, they sank down gratefully, their backs against the cool stone wall. They won't give up, will they? Rose asked after she had caught her breath. Not easily, Garrett admitted, but neither will we. She smiled at that, a true smile that reached her eyes despite their desperate situation. No, we won't. Impulsively, she leaned over and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. For luck, she explained, a blush coloring her face. Garrett felt the spot where her lips had touched him burn as if branded. Without thinking, he reached out, cupping her face in his hand, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "Rose," he began, his voice rough with emotion. The moment shattered as rocks clattered down the slope outside their hiding place. Garrett's hand moved instantly to his gun, his body tensing as he listened intently. "Probably just an animal," he whispered after a minute of silence, but his vigilance didn't waver. They rested in tense silence for another half-hour before continuing their journey, making their way carefully down the far side of the ridge. The descent was more treacherous than the climb, with loose shale that shifted treacherously underfoot, and thorny brush that tore at their clothing and skin. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and their water supply dwindled dangerously. Rose's lips were cracked and bleeding, but she marched on without complaint, following Garrett's lead with unwavering trust. When they finally reached the river in the late afternoon, they fell upon its banks like parched animals, drinking deeply of the cool water. Rose splashed her face and neck, sighing with relief as the water soothed her sunburned skin. "We'll follow the river for about 5 miles, Garrett explained as they rested in the shade of a cottonwood. "Then we'll need to head inland again to avoid a settlement where we might be recognized." Rose nodded, too exhausted for words. Her skirt was torn and filthy, her boots worn through in places, and her hands were blistered and raw. Yet when Garrett suggested they rest longer, she shook her head firmly. "We keep moving," she insisted. "I won't be taken back, not now, not ever." They continued along the riverbank until sunset, making good progress on the relatively flat ground. As darkness fell, they found a secluded spot among a cluster of boulders and made camp for the night. Their supplies were nearly gone, just a few pieces of jerky and half a bag of coffee, but neither mentioned this fact. Seated close together for warmth, they watched the stars emerge, brilliant points of light in the vast desert sky. The silence between them was comfortable now, born of shared danger and growing trust. "I've been thinking," Garrett said finally, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, "about what happens when we reach San Francisco." Rose turned to look at him, her heart suddenly beating faster. "And I could sell my ranch," he said, the words coming slowly as if he was working them out as he spoke. "Use the money to start fresh in California. Buy some land outside the city, perhaps. Raise horses instead of cattle." Hope bloomed in Rose's chest, but she forced herself to be practical. "Garrett, your ranch is your life. I couldn't ask you to give that up for me." He turned to face her then, his expression serious in the starlight. "You're not asking, I'm offering. These past few days, running for our lives, I've realized something." He took her hand gently in his. "Land is just land, Rose. A house is just lumber and nails. They can be rebuilt, replaced, but what I feel for you—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the words. Rose felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they were not tears of sorrow or fear. "What do you feel?" she whispered, needing to hear him say it. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day at the general store when you smiled at me over those bolts of fabric." Rose's breath caught in her throat. She reached out trembling fingers to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his lips. "I love you too," she confessed. "So much that it frightens me." Garrett leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he kissed her gently, a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. Rose responded with a fervor that surprised them both, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "When we reach San Francisco," he murmured, "marry me. Not because anyone is forcing you, but because you choose to." "Yes," Rose answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They spent the night in each other's arms, speaking softly of their dreams and plans for the future. By unspoken agreement, they went no further than kisses and caresses, both understanding that their first time together should come when they were truly free, not while they were fugitives. Dawn found them moving again, following the river for several more hours before turning inland as Garrett had planned. The terrain gradually changed from desert scrub to pine forest as they gained elevation, the air growing cooler and sweeter with each mile. "We should reach Flagstaff by tomorrow afternoon if we keep this pace," Garrett said as they paused to rest in a small clearing. "From there, he broke off abruptly, his head turning sharply at a sound Rose couldn't detect. In one fluid motion, he pulled her behind a massive ponderosa pine, his hand covering her mouth to silence any protest. A moment later, she heard it, two voices, men's voices, coming closer. Through the trees, they glimpsed a group of riders, 6 or 7, moving slowly but purposefully along their trail. "That's Winters himself," Garrett whispered in her ear, indicating a heavy-set figure at the center of the group. Rose felt her blood turn to ice. Bartholomew Winters was not a man to delegate important matters if he was leading the search personally. He would not rest until he found her. They remained motionless until the riders passed, then retreated deeper into the forest, moving with painstaking care to avoid making noise. Garrett led them on a circuitous route, doubling back several times to confuse their trail, always keeping at least a mile between themselves and their pursuers. By nightfall, they had managed to circle around to the east, approaching Flagstaff from an unexpected direction. They made a cold camp that night, not daring to risk a fire that might give away their position. Huddled together beneath a makeshift shelter of pine boughs, they spoke in whispers, planning their approach to the town. Garrett had friends in Flagstaff, a storekeeper named Patrick O'Brien, who had once helped him drive cattle to the railroad and who owed him a favor. "Patrick can get us clean clothes, help us blend in," Garrett explained. "We'll need to look respectable to buy train tickets without arousing suspicion." Rose nodded, thinking practically. "My hair is too recognizable. Perhaps I should cut it." Garrett looked pained at the suggestion. He had often admired her glorious red gold tresses, but he couldn't deny the logic. "If you're certain." With grim determination, Rose took Garrett's hunting knife and sawed off her hair at chin length, watching the long strands fall to the ground with mixed emotions. When she was done, she looked years younger, almost boyish with her short curls. "How do I look?" she asked, attempting a brave smile. Garrett touched the shorn ends gently. "Still beautiful," he said truthfully, "and much less like the woman they're searching for." They reached the outskirts of Flagstaff just after noon the next day, approaching cautiously through the pine forest that surrounded the growing lumber town. From their vantage point on a hill, they could see the railroad station, the main street lined with wooden buildings, and the sprawling lumber mill that was the town's economic heart. "We'll wait until dusk," Garrett decided. "Less chance of being noticed." As shadows lengthened across the town, They made their way to a small house on a side street where Patrick O'Brien lived above his hardware store. The Irishman answered Garrett's soft knock with a shotgun in his hands, which he lowered immediately upon recognizing his visitor. Garrett Dawson. "Mother of God, man, you've got half the territory looking for you," Patrick exclaimed, ushering them quickly inside and bolting the door behind them. "Then you've heard," Garrett said grimly. "Heard. There's wanted posters with both your faces on them from here to Yuma." Patrick turned to Rose, studying her face with open curiosity. "Miss Reynolds, I presume, or should I say Mrs. Winters?" "Never that," Rose said firmly. "And never Miss Reynolds again either if we're successful." Patrick's weathered face broke into a grin. "A love match, is it?" "Well, you've picked a good man, miss, whatever your name might be." With remarkable efficiency, Patrick provided them with food, clean clothing, and information. Winters and Harold Reynolds had arrived in Flagstaff that morning, he told them, and were offering substantial rewards for information. They had men watching the railroad station and the main roads out of town. "The eastbound train leaves at midnight," Patrick said, "but you'll never get aboard at the station. They'll be watching it too closely." "Is Jenkins still the station master?" Garrett asked, an idea forming. Patrick nodded. "Owes me for that time I kept his boy out of jail. I could have a word with him." A plan took shape. Patrick would speak to Jenkins, arranging for the train to make an unscheduled brief stop 2 miles east of town, where a spur line curved through a stand of pine trees. Garrett and Rose would wait there and board while the train was barely moving. As they prepared to leave Patrick's house shortly before midnight, Rose impulsively embraced the gruff Irishman. "Thank you," she said fervently. "We won't forget this." Patrick patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Just be happy, miss. That'll be thanks enough." They slipped through Flagstaff's darkened streets like shadows, avoiding the few people still abroad at that late hour. At the eastern edge of town, they cut through the lumber yard, then followed the railroad tracks into the forest. The appointed spot was marked by a tall pine split by lightning, its pale wood gleaming in the moonlight. They crouched in the undergrowth beside the tracks, listening for the approaching train, each lost in their own thoughts. "Are you afraid?" Garrett asked softly, noticing Rose's tense posture. "Not of leaving," she answered honestly. "Only of being caught." He squeezed her hand. "A few more hours and we'll be beyond their reach." The distant whistle of the train reached them, followed by the rhythmic chuffing of the engine and the rumble of wheels on steel rails. As agreed, the train began to slow as it approached their position, though it still moved at a considerable speed. "Ready?" Garrett asked, rising to a crouch. Rose nodded, gathering her skirts. As the train passed, moving perhaps 15 miles per hour, Garrett grabbed a handrail on the last passenger car and swung himself up onto the narrow platform. Turning immediately, he reached down for Rose, who ran alongside and leapt with more courage than grace into his waiting arms. For a terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge of the platform, her legs dangling over empty space as the ground rushed by beneath her. Then, Garrett pulled her firmly against him, and they tumbled together through the door into the relative safety of the passenger car. Several startled travelers looked up at their sudden entrance, but Garrett's confident manner as he helped Rose to her feet and guided her to an empty seat seemed to allay any suspicions. They were just another couple boarding at an unusual stop, an occurrence not unheard of in the still developing railroad system of the West. As the train gathered speed, heading east toward New Mexico territory, and eventually California, Rose gazed out the window at the receding lights of Flagstaff. Somewhere in that town, her father and Winters were sleeping, unaware that their quarry was slipping from their grasp with each turn of the train's wheels. "We did it," she whispered, Hardly daring to believe it was true, Garrett covered her hand with his own. "We did. And we'll keep doing it, Rose. Every day from now on, we'll choose our own path." She leaned her head against his shoulder, exhaustion finally claiming her as the adrenaline of their escape ebbed away. Within minutes, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even for the first time in days. Garrett remained awake, watching over her, his revolver within easy reach beneath his coat. He harbored no illusions that their troubles were over. Harold Reynolds was not a man to admit defeat easily, and Bartholomew Winters' pride would demand satisfaction. But for now, for this moment, Rose was safe. They were together, and that was enough. The journey to San Francisco took 5 days, with changes of trains in Albuquerque and Los Angeles. They maintained their vigilance throughout, Garrett purchasing newspapers at every stop to scan for news of the search. By the time they reached California, the story had faded from the headlines, but they knew better than to relax completely. San Francisco in 1878 was a city transformed from the rough gold rush town it had once been. Elegant buildings lined its streets, carriages carried fashionable ladies on shopping expeditions, and culture flourished in its theaters and concert halls. To Rose and Garrett, arriving dusty and travel-worn at the station, it seemed a world away from the Arizona territory they had fled. They found lodging in a modest boarding house near the waterfront, taking rooms on separate floors to maintain propriety. Their funds were limited. Garrett had brought what cash he had on hand plus what Thomas had been able to gather quickly, and Rose had only the few pieces of jewelry she had been wearing on her wedding day. On their 3rd day in the city, they were married by a justice of the peace, with only the landlady and her husband as witnesses. Rose wore a simple blue dress purchased the day before, and Garrett had splurged on a new shirt and string tie. It was nothing like the elaborate ceremony Harold Reynolds had planned for his daughter, but as Rose and Garrett exchanged their vows, both knew they would not have changed a single detail. That night, in a small hotel room Garrett had reserved for their wedding night, they came together as husband and wife, their passion tempered by tenderness, their joy in each other unmarred by the hardships that had brought them to this moment. Afterward, as Rose lay in his arms, her head pillowed on his chest, she said softly, "I never thought I could be this happy." Garrett stroked her short curls, which were already beginning to grow out. "This is just the beginning, Rose. I promise you that." In the weeks that followed, they built their new life piece by piece. Garrett sold his horse and saddle, a painful parting but a necessary one, and used the money to rent a small apartment in a respectable neighborhood. Rose found work at a milliner's shop, her artistic talents put to use designing hats for San Francisco's fashion-conscious ladies. Most importantly, Rose enrolled in art classes at a small but well-regarded school, attending 3 evenings a week after her work at the shop was done. Her talent quickly caught the attention of her instructors, and she blossomed under their guidance and encouragement. Garrett, meanwhile, found that his skills as a rancher translated surprisingly well to urban employment. He secured a position as manager of a livery stable, where his knowledge of horses and firm but fair dealing with customers earned him rapid advancement. They were careful, always. They used the name Fletcher in public, saved what money they could, and kept a packed valise ready in case they needed to leave quickly. Rose scanned the newspapers daily for any mention of her father or Winters, and Garrett maintained a correspondence with Patrick O'Brien, who would warn them if trouble was brewing in Arizona. 6 months passed, then a year. Gradually, the need for constant vigilance eased. Rose's artwork began to sell small landscapes and portraits at first, then larger commissions as her reputation grew. Garrett was promoted to oversee all three of the livery owner's stables, with a corresponding increase in salary. They moved to a larger apartment, one with windows that flooded Rose's small studio with northern light. They made friends cautiously, revealing little of their past but opening their home to a select circle of artists, shopkeepers, and stable workers who asked few questions and accepted them as they presented themselves. It was Patrick's letter, arriving nearly 18 months after their flight from Seligman, that finally allowed them to truly relax. Harold Reynolds had suffered a stroke, Patrick wrote, which had left him partially paralyzed and confined to his ranch house. As for Bartholomew Winters, he had apparently found another potential bride, a widow from Prescott with substantial mining interests of her own. "They've forgotten us," Rose said wonderingly as she read the letter. "Or at least decided we're not worth the trouble of finding." Garrett was less certain. Men like Harold Reynolds rarely forgot a slight, but he kept his doubts to himself, not wanting to dim the relief in Rose's eyes. With the specter of pursuit finally lifted, they allowed themselves to put down deeper roots. Garrett, who had been saving diligently, purchased a partnership in the livery business. Rose's paintings hung in several prestigious galleries, and she began to teach art to the children of wealthy families, her gentle manner and genuine talent making her a sought-after instructor. When Rose discovered she was expecting their first child, the news brought both joy and a renewed sense of purpose. Their son, James Thomas Dawson, was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. As they adjusted to parenthood, Garrett found himself thinking more often of the open spaces of Arizona. The crowded city streets, once a haven of anonymity, now seemed constraining. He missed the rhythm of ranch life, the connection to the land, the sense of building something that would last beyond his lifetime. Rose noticed his restlessness, but said nothing until one evening when they sat on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset paint the bay in shades of gold and crimson. James was asleep in his cradle inside, giving them a rare moment alone. "You're thinking of home, aren't you?" she asked, surprising him with her perception. "Of Arizona," Garrett nodded slowly. "Sometimes, but this is our home now." Rose took his hand, her fingers strong and sure. "It doesn't have to be, not forever." He looked at her with surprise. "You love it here." "Your art, your students, I love you more," she said simply. "And James should know more than city streets and foghorns. He should know open skies and horses and the smell of pine trees after rain." Hope stirred in Garrett's chest, but he tempered it with practicality. "Your father is still alive." "Winters too." "My father is an old man now, according to Patrick's letters, and Winters is married to his widow." Rose's expression was resolute. "Besides, we wouldn't go back to Seligman. There's land in Northern California, in Oregon. Places where we could start fresh, but still have the life you miss." The discussion continued for weeks, with both of them weighing the risks and benefits of leaving San Francisco. Rose contacted an art dealer who handled her work, inquiring about opportunities in the smaller cities of the West. Garrett wrote to ranchers he had known, asking discreetly about land prices and business conditions. The decision was made when James took his first steps, lurching across their small sitting room with determination written on his tiny face. Watching him, Garrett and Rose exchanged a look of perfect understanding. Their son deserved space to run, to grow, to become the man he was meant to be. Within a month, they had sold their San Francisco apartment and most of their possessions. Garrett's share in the livery business brought enough capital to purchase a modest ranch near Redding, California, where the Sacramento River wound through fertile valleys surrounded by mountains still largely untouched by development. The journey north was easier than their flight from Arizona had been, but no less momentous. As their wagon crested the final hill, revealing the 200 acres that would be their new home, Rose gasped at the beauty spread before them: rolling pastures, stands of oak and pine, and a small but solid house nestled against a backdrop of distant peaks. "It's perfect," she whispered, clutching James to her chest as the 2-year-old pointed excitedly at a deer bounding across the meadow below. Garrett looked at his wife and son, then at the land that was now theirs. "It's home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The years that followed brought challenges, of course, droughts and harsh winters, the difficulties of establishing a new horse breeding operation, the constant work of maintaining and improving their property. But they also brought immeasurable joys. The birth of their daughter, Emily Rose, in 1883, the gradual expansion of their ranch to include a small but profitable vineyard, the respect and friendship of their neighbors. Rose continued to paint, her work now inspired by the landscapes and people of their new home. Several times a year, she traveled to San Francisco to deliver commissions to her dealer, returning with news of the city and, more importantly, to the loving arms of her family. Garrett built the ranch into a successful enterprise, known throughout the region for the quality of its horses and the fair dealing of its owner. When James turned 10, he began taking on real responsibilities, proving to have his father's affinity for horses and his mother's artistic eye for conformation and movement. News from Arizona came occasionally through Patrick O'Brien, who had moved to Prescott but maintained connections throughout the territory. Harold Reynolds had died in 1885, his ranch divided and sold to pay debts he had accumulated in his final years. Bartholomew Winters remained a powerful figure in territorial politics, but seemed to have long since abandoned any thought of pursuing his runaway bride. It was in the summer of 1888, a full decade after their dramatic escape from Seligman, that Rose and Garrett finally felt secure enough to consider a journey back to Arizona. Patrick had written of a horse auction in Prescott where several exceptional breeding stallions would be offered an opportunity too good to miss for their expanding operation. The decision was not made lightly. They discussed it for weeks, weighing the lingering risks against the potential benefits. In the end, it was Rose who tipped the balance. "I'm tired of looking over my shoulder," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching James and Emily play with their dog in the twilight. "It's been 10 years, Garrett. I want to face the past so we can truly embrace our future." They left the children with Rose's trusted assistant from the vineyard, a widow named Martha who had become like family over the years. The journey to Prescott took them by train and stagecoach, a far more comfortable trip than their last passage through the territory. Prescott had grown substantially since they had last seen it, with grand buildings of brick and stone replacing many of the wooden structures they remembered. They registered at the Palace Hotel under their real names, Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Dawson, a deliberate choice that felt both terrifying and liberating. The auction was scheduled for the following day, but that afternoon, they found themselves drawn to a small art gallery on Montezuma Street. Inside, Rose was delighted to discover several paintings by artists she had known in San Francisco, evidence of the territory's growing cultural sophistication. As they moved through the gallery, a familiar voice behind them caused both to freeze. "Rose Reynolds, is that you?" They turned slowly to face Bartholomew Winters, older and heavier than they remembered, but unmistakable with his piercing eyes and commanding presence. Beside him stood a dignified woman in an elegant burgundy dress, presumably the widow he had married. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Rose straightened her shoulders and said calmly, "It's Rose Dawson now." "Hello, Mr. Winters." Winters' expression was unreadable as his gaze moved from Rose to Garrett and back again. 10 years, he said finally. 10 years since you left me standing at the altar in Seligman. "Yes," Rose acknowledged, her voice steady though Garrett could feel her trembling slightly where their arms touched. Winters was silent for another long moment. Then, to their astonishment, he laughed, a genuine sound of amusement rather than bitterness. "The best thing that ever happened to me," he declared, taking his wife's hand. "If you hadn't run off with your cowboy, I'd never have met Margaret." The woman beside him smiled warmly. "Bartholomew has told me the story many times, though I suspect his version differs somewhat from yours." The tension ebbed from the moment, replaced by a cautious civility. Winters introduced Margaret properly, and they exchanged polite conversation about the changes in the territory over the past decade. "Your father never forgave you," Winters told Rose as they prepared to part ways. "He blamed me, blamed Dawson here, blamed everyone but himself. A hard man to the end." "Yes, he was," Rose agreed simply. There was sadness in her voice but no regret. As Winters and his wife moved away, he turned back briefly. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you found happiness." "We both did, it seems." Watching them go, Garrett put his arm around Rose's waist. "Well, that was unexpected." Rose leaned into him, relief evident in every line of her body. "The last ghost laid to rest," she murmured. "Now we're truly free." They returned to their ranch a week later, having purchased 2 excellent stallions at the auction, and reconnected with Patrick O'Brien, who promised to visit them in California the following spring. The children greeted them with enthusiastic embraces and a flurry of stories about their adventures with Martha. That night, after James and Emily were asleep, Garrett and Rose sat on their porch as they had on countless evenings before, watching the stars emerge above their land. Rose's head rested on Garrett's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. "You ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Leaving everything behind that day, running away with a cowboy you barely knew?" Rose lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction. "Everything I truly needed, I took with me that day, my heart, my hope, my future." She touched his face gently. "My love." Garrett turned his head to kiss her palm. "And to think it all started with a forced bride crying in a chapel, and a cowboy waiting outside with his horse." Rose laughed softly. "The best beginning to the best story, our story." As the night deepened around their home, they remained on the porch, talking quietly of the past they had overcome, and the future they continued to build together. Inside, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even if they couldn't have articulated it, that they were the living embodiment of a love strong enough to defy convention, brave dangers, and create a legacy that would endure long after the Wild West had faded into history. And in the stable nearby, an aging Palomino stallion named Thunder, brought north from San Francisco when they established their ranch, dozed in his stall, perhaps dreaming of a desperate ride through the Arizona desert, carrying 2 hearts toward freedom and a love that would last a lifetime.